There's roughly 35 steps in the process to building one of these drums. And each step is crucial to the quality of the drum, the quality of the build, how well it will hold up, its sound quality. I've said before that my philosophy with building drums and craftsmanship is that there may not be one single thing or one single process that you can do that's going to make a huge difference in the sound or the quality. But there's a lot of small things you can do that will add up to make a big difference, if that makes sense. Every single part, every single process that I do, I treat that with the respect that I would if it was the finished product. That way I know that every single component is going to be of the highest quality. Everything starts with the materials. If you don't start with excellent materials, then you can't expect to have excellent outcomes at the end. When I'm selecting the lumber that I'm going to use for a drum, I'm looking for basically boards that are completely defect free. I don't want anything that's going to affect negatively the sound of a drum, or what the drum looks like, or how well the drum's going to hold up. Things that I'm looking to exclude are things like knots that are in the wood that will affect the integrity of the structure of the drum, and it will affect the sound as well. Looking for any kind of blemish that might be in the wood. I don't want to use that. I'm also looking for cracks and checks in the wood, because even after they come out of the kiln, after they've been cut out of the log by the sawyer, the wood will still move, and that's the moisture going in and out of the wood. Which leads me to the first process that I do, which is flattening the boards, because when they come from the sawyer, they're relatively flat, but they're not perfectly flat, which is what I want. So the first thing I have to do is I have to run it through a machine called a jointer. And what the jointer does is it has a series of teeth in the blade, and then when I run a board across this thing, it will make that board flat. And once I have one flat face, then I can move on to the next step. Okay, now that I have one face of the cherry that is flat, I can now take it over to my planer, and I can plane it down to the thickness that I need it to be for this particular drum. Okay, now I have material that is, one, perfectly flat, and two, the exact thickness that I want it to be. But I still have one more thing I have to do. I will need to glue two of these boards together so they'll be wide enough to make the panels for the drum. Before I can glue these together, I've got to get rid of this gap right here. So what I'm going to do is take these two back over to the jointer, and I'm going to make the edge perfectly flat. After I run the edges through the jointer, what I like to do is bring them up to the window and match them up, and just to make sure that I've good, perfect tight fit. And the way you know is you won't be able to see any light shining through the joint. And that's what we have here. Now I have a joint that I know is correct and it will glue up properly. I need to make sure that the panel itself will be the width that I want it to be. And right now this is too wide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rip the correct width on my table saw using the edge that I just jointed against the fence. That way I know that my straight line rip will be true. Okay, so the boards are ready for glue up to make the panels. They're all cut to width, and I have the edges joined so that they'll have a good glue up. I'm going to save these cutoffs here, and I will use those for the bracing and also for the support system for the snare system. So let me get the clamps out and we'll start gluing them up. All right, guys, we'll leave these in the clamps overnight. I'll come back in the morning. I left these panels in the clamps for the glue to dry, and they should be ready to come out of the clamps now. So we'll get started now. I'm gonna take these out of the clamps, take them over to the planer just to clean them up a little bit, and then we will get started with the milling process that will create the individual panels that will make up our shell. Let's get started. So yesterday when I glued these up, I cleaned up as much of the glue squeeze out as I could with a wet rag, but there's still a little bit left on here. When I was planing these down yesterday, I left enough thickness here so that I knew I'd have enough. I could come back today to clean this up on the thickness planer and take it down to the exact measurement that I want for this particular drum. So now I'm going to take it to the planer, plane it down, clean all this glue up, and then we'll be ready to start milling. Now my material is ready to be milled. I know that I have a flat face, a flat back. I have two straight edges that are perpendicular to each other. So this is ready to go. There were a few imperfections that were exposed while I was preparing the wood, and I'm now going to go through, mark those so that I can avoid them, and then I will lay out rough measurements as to where the cuts will be and number each panel so that I can keep them in order when I glue the drum up. That way the grain patterns will continue all the way around the drum. All right, now that I have the rough measurements drawn onto the boards and I have all imperfections marked, it is time to move over to the radial arm saw. Now I have the 4 panels cut to size that will form the shell. The next step will be to cut the sound hole, but before I do that, I wanted to show you something. This is our 4 panels, and I wanted to show you what I was talking about, how the grain is going to flow through the drum. If you notice this grain pattern right here, it's going to go all the way across. This is where a joint's going to be. but it's going to flow right on around, and it's the grain pattern is going to go all the way around the drum. I'm going to cut the sound hole out on the drill press with this circle cutter. First I need to find the exact center of this panel, and then I will center punch that marking so that my circle cutter will go straight through the board in the exact center of the panel. All right, now we have an outside panel that has a sound hole cut perfectly in it. Now I'm going to carefully, on my router table, I'm going to round over these sharp edges for two reasons. One, I think it looks better, and two, it is inevitable that the owner of the drum will eventually carry the drum by the sound hole, and that'll just make it more comfortable. Now that I have the sound hole cut and rounded over for a smooth finish, I'm going to focus my attention on the opposing panel, where I'm going to laser engrave a logo on the inside of the drum. All right, now we're ready to cut the finger joints. And I'm going to use a jig fixture along with a hand router that's fitted with a straight bit. And I have to be very careful about how I place this in here so that all the fingers, I want them to be able to line up properly. Okay, now that I have all my joinery cut into my panels, what I like to do at this point is go over to my sanding station and just do a light sanding over everything, just to tidy things up a little bit before I do the glue up. That way it makes it a lot easier to do the final sanding after the shell is finished. Now that the drum is sanded, I do a dry fit just to make sure everything's coming together the way I want. Now, if everything was done properly in all the steps beforehand, what we will have here is joints that are nice and tight. Now, the glue that I'm going to use will make those joints swell just slightly, which will make them even tighter. I'm also looking for the fingers to be just slightly proud of the top of the drum. Now when I glue this up, I'm going to use clamps again like I did when I was gluing the panels together, but I'm also going to use a little jig that I built that helps me make sure that everything stays perfectly square. Gluing up finger joints is a very time-consuming process, so rather than take up all your time watching me put glue in between these joints, I'm going to make use of time-lapse. Like I said, time consuming. Now what this press does is it applies equal pressure against the shell and presses it against a perfectly 90-degree angle, and that way it ensures that the drum is square. I let the shell sit in the vise for about 10 minutes. Then I took it out and clamped it up once I knew that it was set up enough that it would stay square. I didn't want to leave it in the vise overnight just in case I wanted to glue up another shell today. I like to go in afterwards and just clean up any glue squeeze out on the inside so that won't be there for me to worry about when I'm sanding. All right guys, we'll let that glue cure overnight, and the next day, today we will finish the shell up and we will start working on the faceplates. This shell glued up great. I have nice tight joints here. There's a few things left for me to do. One of those is I need to get these fingers sanded down flush with the drum. And I'm also going to round over these corners now. But more importantly, this surface here is where the faceplates are going to attach. And I need this to be perfectly flat. So that is the next process. I'm going to use an inverted drum sander to flatten this out. Now that we have a shell that is both square and flat, I'm going to round over the corners at the router table, and then it'll be time to move on to making the faceplates. Okay, now that the milling of the shell is complete, I'm going to sand this real quick just to clean it up a little bit. Now that I have a shell completed, we can move on to making our faceplates. There are several steps that I take to build faceplates. To give you a general idea of how I do it, I will use some walnut panels that I already have set aside for another drum. But basically how I make a faceplate is I take a very thin veneer that I hand pick, and I'm going to sandwich a slightly thicker veneer that I make here in-house called a core between another thin veneer. This will all be glued together. I'll put it in my vacuum press, and when it comes out, it'll be a very thin piece of plywood, but very, very strong because it's glued together with the grain patterns opposite of each other. Now I have a wide variety of veneers that I can use, and I hand-pick them from different dealers all over the United States. Here's an example of some curly walnut. Here's some birch, some black walnut, some Karelian birch, burl. Some crazy stuff there. But what I choose to use with this drum is quilted cedar. The outside of the panel will be the quilted cedar. For the core, which will be slightly thicker than that veneer, I'm going to have to mill it out of the same cherry that we made our shell with. The first thing that I need to do is to cut the cherry to the correct length. The next thing that I need to do is to resaw on the bandsaw. Now that I have my 3 flitches, before I glue them together, I'm gonna take them over to my drum sander and get them all to the same thickness. Now, since I'm gonna be gluing these flitches up end to end with a butt joint, I'm gonna take them over to my joiner again and make sure that these butt joints are perfect. Now it's time to glue up the core. We'll let that dry overnight, and then in the morning we will match that up with the quilted cedar. Okay, I let this dry overnight and everything looks good. Now I need to take the tape off, and I'll take it over to my drum sander and I will sand it down to the exact thickness that I need it to be. Now that the core is the correct thickness, I'm going to trim the pieces up a little bit before I glue them. Now that I have my core and my veneers trimmed to size, there's one more thing that I need to do. Many times with figured wood, such as quilted cedar, the way the grain structure is, whenever it dries, sometimes it tries to twist and it doesn't stay flat. It also gets very rigid. So with this quilted cedar, that's what I've got going on. One, it's not real flexible, but also it's not flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to condition it with a wood conditioner, and then I will press it in my press until it dries. And what that will do is it'll, one, make it perfectly flat so that it'll lay down flat on the core, and also it makes it more flexible and less likely to crack. This vacuum press applies over 18 pounds per square inch. That's a lot of pressure. Now that my faceplate, core, and veneers are prepared, it's time to glue them up and put them in the press. Okay, so I just pulled my panels out of the press. So let's look and see what they look like. All right, we'll let these sit overnight. And tomorrow, they'll be ready to attach to the drum. Before I attach these to the shell, I need to do some milling on it. I want to get it to a little bit closer to the final size, and I need to mark and drill the holes for the screws. But before I do all that, I'm going to apply a sealer coat of shellac. The shellac is going to bring out some of the grain. It's going to make it pop a little. And also, when that hardens, it'll make it easier for me to mill this because this quilted cedar, when you're milling it, it can tend to chip out, and the shellac will prevent that from happening. It really does make the grain pop. Now that my sealer coat has dried, I'm going to lay out my drill pattern, and then I'll head over to the drill press and I will go ahead and drill the holes for the screws. Now that I have the face plates set where I want them, I'm going to trim them flush on the router table. Now that I have my face plates where I want them and trimmed to size, I will finish laying out my drill pattern and get it ready to attach to the shell. Now the face plates are attached, and I'm going to round over the corners just to make it a little more comfortable to play. All right, this drum is really beginning to come together. It's going to be amazing. Now I need to get it ready for the finishing process, which involves a lot of sanding. All right, everything is sanded now and it's ready for finishing. Before I do that though, I'm gonna take the face plates back off and I'm gonna go ahead and install all the bracing for the snare system before I do the finish, because I'm gonna put another coat of shellac sealer on it. And I'm not just gonna do the outside of it, I'm also gonna do the inside of the drum, because as I've mentioned before, the wood is always bringing in moisture or giving off moisture depending on the humidity in its environment. And when it does that, it wants to move. And I want to mitigate that as much as possible. I'm going to mill the parts for the snare bracing from the same cherry that I made the shell from. I've got the snare bracing all set in the shell. Now I'm going to go ahead and put a coat of shellac on the whole thing inside and out. Got a sealer coat of shellac on it. Let this dry overnight, and then I'll put the clear coats on. Everything has been sanded and wiped down with a tack cloth. Now it's time to spray the clear coats. Now I've sprayed all the clear coats and allowed them to cure for several days. All that's left now is to set the snares and do the final assembly. All right, it's all finished. Everything's put together, it's tuned up, and I couldn't be happier with the results. I've taken you all the way from the very beginning of choosing my materials through every step of the process to get to this point. And now there's only one thing left to do. Let's see what it sounds like.